Hello, and welcome to the podcast that tries to answer one simple question. What is this thing called film noir? I'm your host, Sergio Angelini, and welcome to Tipping My Fedora, where we discuss movies, books, TV, radio, and much more besides, all from the darker side of the street. Today's episode focuses on the gangster films made by Edward G. Robinson, examining how they transitioned from Depression-era tragedies of men who took the wrong path to fame and fortune to Noir-era sociopaths in the 40s and 50s who no longer had a place in society, polite or otherwise. My special guest is Craig Ian Mann. He is a film historian, freelance writer and home video producer who works closely with Eureka Entertainment and their Masters of Cinema series. He is the author of Phases of the Moon, A Cultural History of the Werewolf Film, published by Edinburgh University Press in 2020, and has written for the BFI, Eureka, Second Sight Films, Indicator and Arrow Video, amongst others. His latest writing appears in the Second Sight releases of The Hitcher and The Blair Witch Project, and the Masters of Cinema edition of Hugo Fregonese's Black Tuesday, starring, of course, Edward G. Robinson. We had a great chat, and I really hope you enjoy it. Craig, it's so brilliant to have you on the podcast. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
So, before we start talking about Edward G. Robinson and celebrating in our own special way his 131st birthday, I want to ask you two icebreaker questions. The first question is, and I bet you've forgotten I said I was going to ask you this, what's your definition of film noir?
Quite a difficult question to answer because I'm a little bit of a noir skeptic. There are films that I watch and I think of as film noir, things like Out of the Past, or Build My Gallows High as it's sometimes called. To name a couple of Edward G. Robinson films like Double Indemnity or Woman in the Window feel very much like film noir to me. So you've got the kind of chiaroscuro lighting, the expressionist kind of aspect, your femme fatales, your detectives, all that kind of stuff. But I think there's a lot of films that are drawn into or under the film noir label that I wouldn't necessarily consider to be film noir. I struggle with it because it's a retrospective label, right? It's a critical retrospective label.
Yeah.
And for that reason, and because people who are making these films in the 40s and the 50s are largely making them without having that term in mind, I kind of tend to think of these films more as kind of heist movies or crime movies or gangster movies rather than film noir, first of all. So yes, my definition of film noir is incredibly slippery and ambiguous, and that's probably not very helpful to you, Sergio. I apologize.
No, but it's entirely appropriate given what we're discussing, so that's just great. With that in mind, what would be your first film noir that you remember seeing that you would think of as film noir?
The first one I saw was definitely the Robert Mitchum movie Out of the Past, or Build My Gallows High, which I saw when I was at university in 2007. I can't exactly remember which module it was shown to me for. Probably an introduction to film analysis module or something along those lines. That was the first film that I ever saw that was introduced to me as film noir. I will have undoubtedly seen many film noir movies, well, what people would consider to be film noir movies, with my granddad when I was younger. We watched an awful lot of kind of hard-boiled detective movies, westerns, sci-fi, a lot of 50s, 40s stuff, because those were the kind of movies that he loved to watch. But the first film that was ever introduced to me as we're going to watch a film noir was Out of the Past.
Well, it's a fantastic movie. I mean, weirdly, I think I first came about, and this is because I'm so many decades older than you, Craig,
You do yourself a disservice.
Yeah, I know, I'm barely hanging on, mate. Was, of course, the remake, Against All Odds, and the Phil Collins theme song. So weirdly, I was initially aware of that, and then dialed back, because, of course, oh no, Jane Greer's in it. Oh, wait, hang on. And then it's, as you say, Build My Gallows High, the kind of UK release title, which is also the title of the original novel, which confusingly, of course, it's published under a pseudonym, and so it's Daniel Mannering, but who also writes as Jeffrey Holmes. So, never mind, just trying to make life difficult for everybody. So that's how I came across it, and yet it is, in many ways, a totally quintessential film noir, so it's a great choice. So I well done you, I think.
I will never forget that I watched it with one of my best friends sitting next to me, and he was so, we were sitting in a room full of people, so he couldn't have an outburst, but he was very, very, very upset at the end. I remember him sitting there whispering to himself, "Oh, Jeff," at the end of that movie. Really genuinely depressed. And yeah, it was the first kind of introduction to what many people consider to be the codes and conventions of noir. And I think in terms of films that would fit a definition for me, Out of the Past would be at the centre of that, I think. Maybe because it's the first one I saw, or maybe because, as you say, all of the elements are there. If you're going to kind of do a tick list of all of the bits and pieces you would expect there to be in a film noir movie, Out of the Past has all of them.
It's great that you mentioned films like Double Indemnity, which is, one of the very first films like that one that really kind of sets the seal on the style and the approach and the conventions of it. But of course, we've got the Edward G. Robinson factor. When we discuss noir, we have to talk about pre-noir, or prototypes that take you towards the idea of noir as a style that emerged, but as you say, was applied retrospectively. The French started using it for these American films circa 1946, but it wasn't really available in a book until 1955. There is this great photo of Robert Aldrich on the set of Attack with a copy of Panorama of American cinema, film noir. So he was aware of it in that sense. I don't know if he really read French, but obviously he got it after making Kiss Me Deadly. So, which is in many ways the film noir to end film noir, literally and historically, although I actually think film noir stretches into the 1960s anyway. But we're here to talk about Edward G. Robinson. And Edward G. Robinson is a fabulous actor, first and foremost. Terrific performer, I think, and a great movie star. Someone who started in the theatre in the 1920s and became the star there, and who had a big hit playing a gangster in a play called The Racket. He eventually went to Hollywood, and after a few less than thrilling roles, got his big chance with Little Caesar. So let's talk a little bit about Little Caesar. Most people know the ending to that film and don't know much else because it's got that great last line, Mother of Mercy, is this the end of Rico? What do you think about Little Caesar? And, when did you first see that one, actually?
After seeing Out of the Past, one of my ways into noir after that was developing a really intense interest in gangster movies, kind of classic gangster movies. And that ended up leading to doing a public-facing educational course at the Showroom Cinema in Sheffield in 2012, I think. Long time ago now. But one of the films that I showed as part of that course and that I was watching as part of my research for that course before I'd picked the screenings was White Heat, which you've just introduced Edward G. Robinson, and now I'm talking about James Cagney. But I think what was interesting to me about White Heat was that I was introduced to it and I watched it as another film that was labelled as film noir or falling under that kind of noir label. And when I watched it, it didn't feel very much like noir to me. It felt like a continuation of those gangster films that had been released steadily since the 1930s, obviously with some gaps that are kind of related to the Hays Code and so on and so forth. So I kind of saw White Heat as the end point where the Public Enemy started, right? And I think Little Caesar can connect to later Edward G. Robinson films in very much the same way. Edward G. Robinson, yeah, he was in The Racket in 1927, but then he'd also done various films in which he'd played gangster roles because of the fact that he had been in The Racket. So he was in films like The Hole in the Wall, Outside the Law, The Night Ride, The Widow from Chicago. And then he made Little Caesar, where he plays kind of the title role of Rico Bandello or Little Caesar. You've got Little Caesar, you've got The Public Enemy, and you've got Scarface that establish that rise and fall narrative that then comes back throughout the gangster movie all the way through history. There are obviously kind of variations on it at various points of time, where you've got a small-time criminal who rises from the gutter, develops this lavish lifestyle where he commands respect and fear and has all the kind of wealth and fame and fortune that anybody could want, and then kind of falls from grace. And at the end, yes, Mother of Mercy, is this the end of Rico, when he's kind of gunned down in the street. Funnily enough, maybe this shows that I don't watch films as closely as I would like to believe. The last time I watched Little Caesar was the first time I had ever noticed that he dies in front of a billboard. that kind of is showing that the other two characters have ended up in this nice loving relationship. First time I'd ever noticed what was actually on the billboard.
Craig,
I was so focused.
The irony.
I know. Was so focused on his dying moments and actually feeling quite sorry for him, which I think is the important point of that film, right? The thing that marks out those movies from the early 1930s is that you feel quite invested in, sympathetic towards, and quite sorry for the gangsters when they do actually meet their end. You know, think about James Cagney being piled through the door of his mother's house at the end of The Public Enemy, for example. There's something quite sad about it. And I guess that's because it comes from that period around Prohibition, around the Depression, where the American people are they're downtrodden, they can't get a job, many of them have lost their houses, and they can't even have a drink. And so gangster movies become, gangsters and gangster films become quite attractive. And I think Little Caesar is fascinating in that regard, in that it does genuinely make the gangster lifestyle seem quite attractive. And especially when you think of it in terms of being the member of an audience in America in 1931, you can see how people would be drawn to those characters.
It's definitely the specular version of the American dream at a time when people thought that it was all ending, and very convincing. When I rewatched it, I thought the opening scene at the diner, which actually made me think of Edward Hopper's Nighthawks, but also makes me think a little bit of the beginning of The Killers, the Hemingway, because of course it hadn't been filmed yet, but the original short story. And you've got these two characters, and the other one's played by Douglas Fairbanks Jr. There's quite a contrast between the two. One is sort of waspy, and the other one is much more ethnic. The wrong ethnicity, he's not Italian, but he's playing Italian. The contrast between the two is such that at the beginning of the film, you're not even 100% sure who the protagonist is. In an odd way, because although he eventually becomes Little Caesar, so you know it's about him, but initially he's not at the forefront of the action. It takes a little bit of a while before he gets established, and in that sense it's a rise to success story. He becomes part of the gang and then slowly rises to the top, takes control, at which point he becomes the leader, and it's the American way. And yet he has doubts the whole time. And also I think that there's an interesting bromance element. He seems to have very strong feelings about the Douglas Fairbanks character, and it's very interesting how that develops. I mean, it's his fatal flaw, really, isn't it? After all, I mean, that's what lets him down, because he lets the other guy sort of off the hook when really he should have wiped him out.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about that first scene is it's very much setting up Rico's motivations, that when he reads the newspaper and reads about the gangster community honouring this great gangster, and he says, well, look at us, we're a couple of nothings, we're nobody. I'm paraphrasing, but that's along the lines of what he says, which kind of establishes his motivations for why he wants to then kind of get involved in that gang and take over it and get to the top. He's very obsessive about wanting respect, I think, more than anything, wanting to be respected, well, seen as somebody, right? That's the main point. He wants to be somebody instead of a nobody. Yeah, his relationship with Douglas Fairbanks is really interesting, and one thing I thought of while you were talking there, which I've never actually thought about before, is that actually that kind of establishes some of the kind of masculine codes and conventions of the gangster movie, doesn't it? You know, that you should be a man and behave like a man, and brotherhood is more important than anything else, which of course we later find out is a major tenet of being a member of the Cosa Nostra or the mafia, that you are allied to your brothers and that kind of mafia family more so than your wife or your children or anybody outside of that organisation, which is interesting, of course, because Little Caesar is released a long time before anybody is aware of those codes and conventions of the mafia, which only become apparent much, much later. So that is an interesting element that then follows through gangster movies for decades and decades to come. That idea of being loyal to your brothers. But his downfall is, yes, letting him leave the gang and go and do his own thing, which is fascinating.
I mean, it's a different route to success, isn't it? He sort of becomes a dancer and then kind of goes Hollywood, as it were, and it's sort of almost, it's the George Raft story. Almost. You know, if we believe the stories about George Raft.
The film doesn't let you revel in the Douglas Fairbanks character's success in the same way it does with the Edward G. Robinson character. You see so much more of the power and wealth and success that Rico has gathered around himself than you do of the Fairbanks character, I think. Which is interesting because the film seems to be suggesting that actually it's more legitimate to go off to Hollywood and become a star than it is to be a gangster. But at the same time, it shows you so much more of Rico's success. And then obviously in the third act, loses everything, ends up in a hostel for homeless people, and is clearly kind of, you know, it shows you what happens when all of that disappears. But it's interesting that at the height of it, you see so much more of what it's given to Rico than what it's given to the Fairbanks character.
I mean, it's a classic kind of rise and fall structure. It's sort of interesting how strictly it adheres to that, in the sense that it's a pre-code film. And these are the sorts of films that very quickly fell foul of the Hays Code when it got real teeth in 1934. And yet the attraction is, as you say, is very real. Even though you show it's a road to ruin, there's something very dynamic. One of the ways that they make him sympathetic, even in the ending, and I don't think it's a spoiler to say, he gets killed at the end by the cops, is of course that the forces of law and order, they just, it's kind of point and shoot, really. It's not about put your hands up and we'll put the cuffs on you. They pretty much just take him out, as gangsters would. I find that really interesting that they get away from that. So I think it's very clear how they're pitching this to the audience.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll inevitably end up talking more about this when we come to films like Bullets or Ballots and G-Men in the mid-1930s. But the cops in gangster movies in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s tend to be presented not that much different from the gangsters. They're. In
the spring of 1934, the production code really asserts itself, and you get the long list of rules of do's and don'ts, all the things you're allowed to do and you're not allowed to do, which actually creates all kinds of difficulties for certain sorts of films because they can't get re-released. One of the things that's interesting is the studio that was most closely associated with the gangster figure was Warner Brothers, and they're the ones who are going to suffer the most from being told that it wasn't okay to have gangsters in your films, let alone whether you're glamorizing them or not. I think actually just having gangsters became vaguely problematic. So you couldn't have powerhouse actors like Robinson and James Cagney playing them because they're so charismatic that all the attention is being sucked in by them. They get all the oxygen in the room, even if they're not supposed to be nice. But the fact is, you're going to watch them anyway. Like in White Heat, after all, he's a complete psycho. You want to see what happens to him, and you want to see him act and do things, even if they're horrible. You have no interest whatsoever in seeing him being rehabilitated and entering polite society. Here, one of the things that's interesting about Little Caesar is, of course, its depiction of high society, and this idea of that actually there's a lot of the wealthy elites are kind of slightly connected with gangsters and gangsterism, and
the wealthy elite being connected with crime and corruption.
My goodness. I know, hard to imagine,
Who would
right?
be shocked?
And here we are 90 years later, and it's still a surprise somehow. But therefore, I think Warner Brothers were the ones who were perhaps the smartest, but had to be, to find a way around it. So 1935, James Cagney is starring in G-Men. So he is now someone who has connections with the underworld, comes from that world in the sense of living in it, but ultimately decides initially I think for personal reasons, because a friend gets killed who's joined the FBI, and he decides he's going to be an FBI agent, and so he's the G-Man, government man, and so he's switched to the other side, but he hasn't actually had to change his personality. He hasn't really had to change his background, but he's still able to make it okay with the censors. Bullets or Ballots is a film from the following year, 1936, and it's sort of trying to do the same thing for Robinson, isn't it? It's sort of saying, let's find a way to still exploit the milieu and still have that part of the winning personality, because Warner Brothers, perhaps more than any other studio, had a tendency to really pigeonhole their stars, which is why you constantly had this problem with people going on suspension, because they just kept making them make the same kind of movie over and over and over again until they were exhausted, at which point they'd get rid of them. And here with Robinson, who was always a bit more varied anyway, and his contract allowed for him to have one external film per year anyway and things like that, so he always mixed it up a bit. I mean, I love the opening of Bullets or Ballots. I think that's so clever. I mean, the movie within the movie. Tell me what you think about that, because I just think it's fantastically clever and amusing and absolutely having a go at the censors at the same time.
Yeah, you've got Humphrey Bogart, who plays a character called Bugs Fenner, which is an amazing name, going to watch a documentary or a newsreel about organised crime with his boss, where organised crime is described as a growing national menace, as I remember, yes. And kind of very clearly digging into that. Well, if this is how you wanted gangsters to be represented, this is how we will represent them, as a kind of evil or a scourge on society. But then, as you say, the narrative allows for Edward G. Robinson, plays a cop called Detective Johnny Blake, to act, talk and behave exactly like a gangster, which funnily enough he does even before he decides to go undercover in the mob. There's a scene very, very early in the film where he just beats the shit out of somebody with very little provocation, and then he goes undercover in the mob, kind of fakes the fact that he's been fired from the NYPD and goes undercover with a bunch of racketeers, and for the rest of the film just behaves exactly like he did in Little Caesar, but you're always aware of the fact that underneath it he's a police officer. But I do think that it's not just the enforcement of the motion picture production code that led to that change. I think that's a big thing in terms of pushing Hollywood towards, okay, well, if we want to make gangster movies, we're going to have to make them in a different way. But I also think that the public probably wasn't that interested in seeing organised crime figures presented quite so sympathetically as they had been in the early 1930s, because the organised crime figures that they'd been looking up to in the age of Prohibition and the Depression were either dead or in prison. So Al Capone was in prison by this point, and I think in 1934 he was moved to Alcatraz. That's quite a big story. John Dillinger dies in 1934 immediately after a screening of Manhattan Melodrama, which is one of the very last pre-code gangster movies. It comes out of the Biograph Theatre in Chicago and ends up in a gun battle with the FBI and dies. You've even got kind of figures like Lucky Luciano, who I can't exactly remember whether he was in prison by 36. But he would be not that long afterwards if he wasn't already in prison. You've got big mob figures or Depression-era bank robbers who are either in prison or dead. And so the narrative has changed somewhat. These are no longer kind of household heroes who are supplying your booze when nobody else will, or who seem attractive because everyone's kind of suffering through the Depression and they've got all this power and wealth. They've become figures who are at the forefront of the headlines because of their downfalls, not because of their rise. And I think that these films are about those efforts to bring down those gangsters. They just also allow actors like James Cagney and Edward G. Robinson to behave in much the same way by being law enforcers trying to bring them down rather than actually being on the wrong side of the law.
There's always that topical feel that we associate with the early Warner Brothers films when Daryl Zanuck was sort of in charge of production, because they had this ripped from the headlines style. And here this is very much Bogart and Burton McClane are basically playing sort of Lucky Luciano and Dutch Schultz, a version of a romanticized, fictionalized version of their dynamic. And yet at the same time, you've got elements within the story which actually I think working class audiences would have completely connected with. I mean, first of all, it's got a great role for the African-American actress Louise Beavers. She has a nice role as part of this subsidiary subplot that features Joan Blondell. So she's this seemingly quite successful nightclub hostess, but also she's running a numbers racket, which in essence was connected with policy and banks for people who couldn't get regular bank accounts, but which is a form of lottery betting based on usually the results of horse races. And a lot of working class people did that. There was huge amounts of money in it. But what happened was that they eventually got taken over by the big criminal gangs. They were organized, so they took over all these little organizations, and which is then, of course, is part of the book Tucker's People, which later got turned into a fantastic movie by Abraham Polonsky, which is Force of Evil. But that's totally noir, but that's the late 1940s, so we're not there yet. So this is sort of as it's happening in the 30s. And there's all that there, which is thrilling. One of the things that I think is worth pointing out as well is that for two reels, you don't know that Edward G. Robinson is undercover. They do one of those things that it's been done several times since, but he seemingly is sort of passed over for promotion, kicked out for being an occasional reckless policeman, and then he eventually goes to the dark side. And that's a kind of plot line that got used in, the Godfather films over and over, for instance. And here, it's over 20 minutes before you actually get to a scene where he gets himself arrested, goes into a cell, and there meets his boss and sort of says, so how's it going being undercover? And lets the audience off the hook. But for 20 minutes, you get to see him be seemingly somebody who's going to go and be a gangster. And of course, because it's Edward G. Robinson, you completely buy it. It says, yeah, sure. But it's got to get past the censors. But they are stretching it as far as it will go. And I think that's terrific.
There's 2 points on that, which is, first of all, I find it hard to believe that anybody watched that film and didn't realise that he was infiltrating the mob for the police.
Hey,
because
I didn't.
It seems so obvious. It seems so obvious. But also, I love Bullets or Ballots. I would like to say that before I say what I'm about to say. I cannot believe that the mobsters believe that he wants to join up with them. It makes zero sense that they would just accept that a guy who very, very recently was a member of the NYPD suddenly wants to be a gangster. There's this slightly contrived plot that the mob boss has asked him to join their organisation several times and he's refused, and then they finally managed to convince him to do it.
Well, they're friendly. They're actually sort of friendly.
Yeah.
I mean, it goes back to what you were saying before, this idea that they're more similar than you would like, frankly, and that therefore there is this kind of, what we would now refer to incorrectly as, because they're a bit simpatico. I do hate that phrase. Nonetheless,
partially, I think it's because when you watch it with the knowledge of how the mafia works, which again, people did not know how the mafia worked at this point in time, it's unbelievable that they would allow an ex-cop to join their organisation because obviously this would never happen in the actual mafia. Yeah, it's fascinating that fact is hidden. You would think that because G-Men was hugely popular, it was very, very popular and made a big, big profit. You would think that the people who went to go and see G-Men would be the same people who would go and see Bullets or Ballots and would probably go into it with that understanding that there's an infiltration narrative happening here. But you're right, it is very heavily stretched to kind of placate the senses in that on one hand they're appealing to the public with the Edward G. Robinson is a gangster in this movie narrative, but placating the senses with that reveal later in the film that he's behaving that way in order to bring them down. I think it works a little bit better than perhaps something like The Amazing Dr. Clitterhouse or I Am the Law, which are both kind of late 30s movies where Edward G. Robinson is doing a similar thing. So in I Am the Law, which is actually a Columbia movie, yes. I think, he plays a law professor called John Lindsay, who agrees to be the kind of special prosecutor to build a case against racketeers. I think the reason why that film doesn't work quite so well is because it gets very, very bogged down in the legal drama and is not very action-driven. But also when it does become action-driven, it's quite unbelievable that Professor John Lindsay, kind old Professor John Lindsay, who you've been introduced to as a character who forgets to put his pipe out before he puts it in his pocket and therefore sets fire to his own suit several times, suddenly challenges 3 gangsters to a one-on-one fist fight at once and then beats them all up in a room. And wins, yes, and beats them all up in front of the press and the police and everything. And trying to amalgamate that kind of crime fighter personality with a gangster personality, I think doesn't work quite so well in that case, nor in The Amazing Dr. Clitterhouse, where you've got a scientist who wants to study criminal behaviour, immersing himself in the criminal underworld. I think Bullets or Ballots, although when you watch it in retrospect, and especially with an understanding how these kind of criminal organisations work and the fact they would never ever let a person they know is a police officer into their organisation, I think it stands with G-Men as definitely the best of those examples of studios trying to make gangster movies but with protagonists who are law enforcers rather than gangsters.
What I like about Bullets or Ballots is, as you say, because we start with this newsreel that makes fun of depictions of gangsters on the screen, and then we see what they're really like. But at the same time, what it also does is, of course, it goes back to this idea that was a little bit present in Little Caesar, this idea that actually the people behind it all are actually money men. And in this case, they are honest to God bankers, and they are the absolute villains of the piece. I found that fascinating because it's positioned like the censors made us do this. There, I felt like they were kind of really taking a pop at the Giannini brothers, who ran Bank of America, but who were also crucial in allowing the Hayes people in and really take control in 1934, because they felt they were going to lose money if they didn't do it, but also because they absolutely pushed the Catholic Legion of Decency number, and the Gianninis were all good Catholic boys. And that was how they really got their foot in the door and kept it there for the next 30 years. And I find that so interesting that they're just, again, making fun and making ironic comment on that. I think that's what gives this film yet another dimension and makes it an even better movie. I think it's a terrific film.
We also have to remember that the Depression didn't just end when the New Deal came in. You know, it took years and years for the Depression to actually end and for America to recover from that kind of economic slump. So it kind of makes sense that throughout the 1930s, especially with a patchy understanding of how these kind of large organised crime groups actually functioned in reality, which is something the American public isn't going to discover until later, it makes sense that the ultimate evil is going to be traced back to fat cat capitalists who America are blaming for the Wall Street crash and for the depression that follows afterwards. So it is a very interesting point that the gangsters are sort of not the ultimate evil. They're sort of one step down from the ultimate evil, which actually is legitimate businessmen who are allowing their tentacles to spread into illegitimate business.
Yeah.
Which is a very important point.
I mean, in a way you could argue it's actually a bit more sophisticated in terms of what it's trying to depict and in its own little way. Now, interestingly, one of the last honest-to-goodness traditional gangster roles that he would play in the 1930s is actually at MGM in The Last Gangster, which very amusingly starts with this opening title card. It says, "This story starts in 1927. America in the criminal chaos of a national mistake." So I love that. So this is basically MGM saying that Prohibition was a really bad idea. I find that fascinating. I can't believe they got away with that, actually. I think that's really great. Now, the Volstead Act had been repealed in 1933, so it was all recent history, but it was definitely in the past. I mean, this is still when films occasionally had title cards as well. You get a bit of writing at the front. And I found that very, very amusing. But equally, he plays a very, very strange gangster in this film. In a way, it's almost like The Last Gangster is almost like a perfect title for Robinson. It's going to be almost the last gangster role that he plays for over a decade, really.
He's essentially just Al Capone.
He really is, yeah.
The way that it plays out is very much the story of Capone. I think it's very similar to Predates, but it's very similar to the Roaring Twenties in that it's allowing for that kind of fairly standard rise and fall arc in the kind of first act of the film, but all of the kind of acts of violence that you see in the movie. So The Last Gangster in the kind of first act features a fictionalization of the St. Valentine's Day massacre when Prozac kills most of his rivals, the Kyle brothers, in an act that's very, very reminiscent of the St. Valentine's Day massacre. But I think very similarly to the Roaring Twenties, it confines a lot of that violence to the past, and that opening title card is part of that. You know, it's 1927. Don't worry, this stuff doesn't happen anymore. The gangsters are all gone now. But if we look at it historically, then we can show some of these violent events and maybe not draw the ire of the censors. I think what's fascinating to me about The Last Gangster is that it combines three new approaches to the gangster movie that James Cagney had taken in three different movies. So you've got the Roaring Twenties, which confines that kind of rise and fall standard narrative from sort of the Public Enemy, Little Caesar days to the past, and therefore makes it kind of safely a decade earlier. Secondly, a lot of the film is set in prison because Prozac is arrested on charges of tax evasion, much like Al Capone had been. He ends up in Alcatraz with some lovely location shots of Alcatraz, which I don't know whether those are freshly shot or whether they were archive footage.
I'm pretty sure they're taken from other movies. A lot of the shots are definitely taken from The Big House, 1931.
Right. But they are some lovely shots of Alcatraz as the boat is approaching and everyone's realising, because they're not, the prisoners are not told where they're being taken in the film. So then much of the film plays out in Alcatraz and has a kind of prison movie narrative similar to Each Dawn I Die or San Quentin, which are two films from the late 1930s where kind of standard gangster narratives are being moved to prison settings. So it's like, it's okay because they've already been punished, so they can do horrible things. They're already behind bars. And then thirdly, there's that kind of sense of giving the gangster a chance at redemption, which for Cagney comes along in Angels with Dirty Faces. Apologies, but the end of Angels with Dirty Faces is quite famous, so hopefully I can discuss it. Where Cagney is asked by his friend who is a priest to pretend to have turned yellow, I believe is the phrase that's actually used in the film, but essentially show cowardice when he's taken to the electric chair in order to turn the kids who idolise him, the dead end kids, away from crime. And obviously it has that famously ambiguous ending where Cagney refuses to do that, but then as he's being taken to the electric chair, he actually does do that, and you don't know whether he actually is a coward or whether he's doing it for their benefit. What's interesting about The Last Gangster is that Prozac, immediately before he goes to prison, his new wife becomes pregnant. She gives birth to his son, and then while he's in prison, she comes to discover the full extent of his criminal career. She leaves him, and she begins a relationship with a newspaper reporter called Paul, who's played by James Stewart. And James Stewart is being very, very Jimmy Stewart in this movie, which is perfect for the role that he plays. And James Stewart becomes a kind of surrogate father to her son. And much of the second act leading into the third act is Edward G. Robinson behind bars stewing on the fact that his wife has a new husband. And there's a scene scene in The Last Gangster that's very, very similar to White Heat. Very similar to White Heat in the kind of mess hall where Joe Krozak loses his temper.
Yes.
And it's very similar to the similar scene in White Heat. But then when he comes out and goes off to go and obviously take revenge on his wife and reclaim his child, who he's made very clear his kid will grow up to be a tough guy just like him, the film gives him a chance at redemption. I don't know how much more you want to say about that, because The Last Gangster is a movie that less people have
seen.
So
in a way, actually a little bit harder to get hold of as well. But let's not give things away. I mean, I think there are important takeaways in that film. One, as you say, the way that they position it as most of it is in the past. You have the long, more or less 10 years in prison, and then now we're in the present day, which is mostly signalled effectively with Robinson with his sort of hair being greyed a bit, and James Stewart very, very unconvincingly by giving him this horrible moustache, which just does not work and is obviously straight out of a can. Of course, one of the more obnoxious aspects of the story, which is one of the ways that we signal that he is, and this is the film which is referred to as Little Napoleon, is that he's really just married this woman because he wants to have a child.
He wants an heir,
doesn't he? And that's kind of, so he's got to be a boy, of course. And that's it. Very sort of nice and sort of sweet with her, but only because this is the only thing that matters to him. It's the heir is the only thing that matters.
He turns against her immediately once he finds out that isn't going to happen, that she's going to start this new relationship, take the son away from him. I mean, this is really the film, I think, where this kind of characterization of gangsters, and this is one of the reasons why I'm a little bit skeptical about the idea that some of the later gangster movies are film noir, because I can see these changes happening before the period where somebody would say that film noir begins, is that Joe Krozak is despicable. He's not likable in any way, shape or form. He is a snarling, mean-spirited, selfish bastard, basically, who wants to get exactly what he wants things to be exactly the way that he wants them, and if they aren't, he will turn to violence. And it's only again, I don't want to say too much, but it's only in the third act that he's given something of a chance of redemption in a similar kind of way to the way Cagney is in Angels with Dirty Faces, that maybe softens that a little bit, but he is
barely. And I agree, he's a much more repellent figure, and partly it's just so weird that this is an MGM movie, first and foremost. Really not a studio that's remotely associated with it, but they did make films like The Big House, and they did a bit of a talent raid at Warner, so that the Thin Man is in essence a kind of Warner Brothers movie made at MGM under the same conditions by the same people. And as you mentioned, Manhattan Melodrama was also an MGM movie. But nonetheless, the title sort of suggests that it's a way of, like I say, putting it in the background, but they've made him about as nasty as they can probably manage. He's very good in it. I mean, again, it's the standard problem, is that actually Stewart, who at this point is in that early part of his career, so that he had made one film, I think, where he turns out to be the surprise villain, where for a second you get a flash of that kind of more neurotic aspect to his characterizations that will
the Anthony Mann
exactly, from the late 40s onwards. But here you don't see that until he comes back from the war, and he's a much older guy, and he's wearing a toupee, and here he's just he's completely cancelled out by Robinson's portrayal, because it's an absolute powerhouse. So there is this kind of narrative imbalance.
He's doing a kind of softer version of what he would do in the kind of Frank Capra movies. He's the loving family man, who does kind of fall a little bit into the background because Edward G. Robinson is on such kind of full form.
Yes.
in the most snarling evil gangster role that he'd done up to that point. Of course, he was going to do roles that were worse.
And we're going to get there shortly, yes.
But yeah, I'm a huge James Stewart fan.
Oh yeah, me too. I'm not knocking him. I just think in this film,
but he does get a bit overshadowed.
Well, yes. It's in a way it's that the film is weirdly structured of necessity, but the past, it's like it's a Warner Brothers movie. The present is mostly presented in this kind of the idealized domestic, everything is okay, MGM Americana, and you've got this weird interloper in the shape of Edward G. Robinson and Lionel Stander. Lionel Stander gets a terrific supporting role as someone who seems like almost like the comedy relief in the early part of the film and becomes an outright villain. And that's actually a very strong scene. But yes, let's not give things away. But on the other hand, talking about Capra, I Am the Law, which was again made for Capra's home studio, Columbia, and at the time, and was written by Joe Swerling, who had written a number of early Capra films, does have this slightly odd feel to it because of the seeming sort of comic aspects of the characterization. Robinson plays this avuncular professor type who's a little bit forgetful with his pipe and who doesn't really like going on holiday, and he's due to go for a sabbatical and he doesn't really want to take it, and his wife is having to drag him and he's looking for ways not to do it. So he ends up being set up as this kind of crime commissioner and he's got to clean up the rackets in 30 days. It's obviously easy peasy. And that's what he's going to do instead of going on holiday. And then it tonally has these odd shifts. And I think ultimately it's a lighter film and doesn't have quite the same heft to it that we associate even with Last Gangster, as well as the Warner Brothers films. On the other hand, you could argue that by the time it gets to its ending, some of the things that the Robinson character sort of lets pass, including sort of letting characters sort of kill themselves, is pretty nasty. And yet somehow it's not meant to have the same kind of impact, is it?
Well, I suppose that both I Am the Law and The Last Gangster come from a similar sort of view of gangsters in the late 1930s, which is that in an ideal world they would have been a thing of the past, something that America had kind of rid itself of. I think part of the characterization of Edward G. Robinson at the end of The Last Gangster, when he comes out of prison, is this idea of him being this relic from a bygone time, hyper-masculine, toxic, violent, and he doesn't fit in the world that has come about in the 10 years that he's been in prison. And I Am the Law is doing a very similar thing, I think, but from the flip side. I think you're right. I think it is a very tonally inconsistent movie, which is one of the reasons why I don't think it works, and it's one of the few films that we're talking about as part of this podcast that I'm not a huge fan of and wouldn't choose to watch very often. And I think part of that is that tonal inconsistency and the fact that it can't seem to decide what it wants to be. But yes, without going into too much detail, I think there are some interesting decisions that Edward G. Robinson's character decides to make at the end, but he's still allowed to be this kind of jovial, bumbling professor who desperately wants to bring down the rackets.
I'm always fascinated by what you could refer to as gimmicks, and in this one it's this sort of trap that they set by using 16mm film cameras through a two-way mirror, and that's how they're going to prove who the baddie is. And it's utterly unconvincing, and you know that technically it wouldn't have been possible. They would have needed gigantic floodlights to light for 16mm. I like the fact that some of these films are a bit self-reflexive in that respect. I mean, it's something that just appeals to me in terms of late stage gangster movies. So there's this sense that we're getting to the end of that cycle. And then, of course, the war starts. Everything changes, and noir as something that has been identified as a mood, a style that started to apply itself to certain sorts of crime pictures, more or less from Maltese Falcon. With the John Huston version of Maltese Falcon, you can compare that with the two previous attempts by the studio. And you can sort of say, well, this is how it's a bit different. This is why we can maybe think of this as noir, whereas the other one kind of isn't. Huston and Bogart had a strong relationship, worked together several times. So we then get to mid-stage in Robinson's career. He's left Warner Brothers, moving from studio to studio. He's not under any long-term contracts, but doing extremely well with films like, admittedly, a supporting role in Double Indemnity, classic movie, but he's the heart and soul of that film in a way which is kind of great. It's great that he's getting to play that kind of role. And then he also gets to play the lead in films like Woman in the Window and Scarlet Street and House of Strangers and Night Has 1,000 Eyes, which you and I have talked about because it's an interesting mixture of elements. And to call it pure noir would be daft because I think it doesn't succeed that way. On the other hand, I am very drawn to the idea that you can have supernatural noir, and you have to make certain concessions for that, because it's more about saying maybe just the style's a bit Germanic, but it is a crime story, and a big chunk of it's told in flashback, and you have a hero who's sort of crushed by his Cassandra complex in this case, which feel like definite noir figures. And as a film made by people who were quite closely connected with noir in general, what do you think about that film? We've both seen it fairly recently. What did you think on a rewatch?
The thing I find fascinating about Night Has a Thousand Eyes is that it's essentially a 1940s version of The Dead Zone. You've got a man who can foretell people's deaths. I wouldn't think of it as noir, to be honest. I was quite surprised to see it having been labelled as noir. It seems to me like a kind of... The 1940s were actually quite light on horror, right? Because obviously Universal was trying various things to make horror stick, and in the early 1940s they were very successful, and as the 1940s went on, horror became less and less popular, and we ended up with... So I think Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein is the same year as Night Has a Thousand Eyes. Yeah. So that's when Universal's moving towards parody. I would think of it as a horror film rather than as a film noir movie. I think there's an awful lot of the kind of existential dread that you might expect to find in noir, but I find it's framed in a much more kind of horror movie kind of way.
It could so easily work as a Val Lewton production, I think.
It feels very much like a Val Lewton movie, yes, and maybe that's what I'm getting at. It feels more like the kind of horror that Val Lewton was making in the 1940s. I am always very surprised when people kind of throw Val Lewton's horror movies in with film noir. They feel like exercises in moving horror into a new decade and kind of expanding the possibilities of the aesthetics of horror than they do noir film. I think there is an expansive expressionist influence across cinema of the 1940s that also crosses into those films that we might call film noir. So one of the reasons that I mentioned White Heat at the beginning of this discussion and thinking about how it related back to The Public Enemy, and I think we can say the same thing about Key Largo, which I'm assuming we're about to come on to discussing, in terms of thinking about that in relationship to Little Caesar, is that I think there are an awful lot of things that are in those films that people might consider to be noirish, that either are continuations of things that have been happening in the gangster movie for a long time, or are directly related to what's actually happening in the real world with organised crime figures and police responses to organised crime and newspaper stories and ripping from the headlines, as it were, all the way back to the 1930s. So with Key Largo, you've got the continuation of Edward G. Robinson's gangster characters turning into absolute bastards. But as we've discussed, that's something that goes back to The Last Gangster in 1937. And I also think that one of the most important things that people uphold as an element of film noir is that fatalism and the idea that the protagonist is in a death drive and will eventually end up dead one way or another. That's something that's been common to the gangster movie all along. The rise and fall narrative, the fall in the vast majority of movies is death. And that's something that's been developing all the way through the gangster movie up until the 1940s. So I don't think the fact that they have that kind of fatalistic attitude to them, especially because it's the gangster who dies in those films. If you think about Black Tuesday or Key Largo, it's the gangster that dies, it's not the protagonist. Whereas in film noir, we would quite often expect it to be the protagonist that you've been drawn to love and to sympathise with, who would meet his end before the end of the movie.
But surely the argument would be that the thing about the gangsters, particularly from the 1930s, is that they're not fatalistically thinking that this is going to happen to them. They're too busy having a good time or getting to the top of the heap. Whereas in noir, right from the beginning, they tend to assume that they're for the chop. So that if we look at something like Night Has a Thousand Eyes, the problem is that they are haunted by this idea of death, this kind of morbid sensibility. Now, absolutely, that's what you would connect with the Val Lewton films. While you could argue the toss with something like Cat People, which just has, arguably one of the best femme fatales ever, it's The Seventh Victim that I think you have to consider it a film noir. I do. Because there are no supernatural elements in it at all. There are people who believe in the supernatural in it, but you see zero evidence of it at all. You can argue with The Leopard Man that's which again is another, like Night Has a Thousand Eyes. The Leopard Man was an adaptation of a Cornell Woolrich book, in this case Black Alibi, so therefore it's more of a murder mystery, but I don't think tonally it's the least of that initial trilogy. But I always think that The Seventh Victim, in particular, because it's so bleak, so dark, so consumed by the idea of characters who are obsessed with the idea of not living. And with something like Night Has a Thousand Eyes, which is released, 5 years later, based on a novel that had come out a couple of years before, that, he is literally haunted by this idea. Now, it's worth saying, in the book, the protagonist is the young woman, and he's actually quite a marginal figure. It's not really what the book's about. And this is where, therefore, I think you can perhaps, granted, require some foreknowledge, but in making the shift to make it a star vehicle for a male lead actor, in this case Edward G. Robinson, away from making it a story about the young woman who has a less interesting role because she's just the sort of the daughter who's psychologically damaged, and at the beginning of the film she wants to kill herself. And then we get this gigantic flashback, which, I mean, believe it or not, in the book it's 100-page long chapter. She does her flashback. It's not his flashback, it's her flashback. She tells all about her life story, how she lost her mum, she's really connected with her dad, all these sorts of things. But in making it about a character who is haunted by the idea of death and that they can't control their destiny and yet somehow can see other people's, that seems a very noirish idea. And obviously director John Farrow and writer Jonathan Latimer, who did the adaptation, they made a number of films that would fall within the category without any kind of problem, even within a fantasy context. The next film that they worked on, more or less, was Alias Nick Beale, which followed on from The Big Clock. I love the idea of connecting it to Dead Zone, though.
I was going to say, in terms of thinking about developments in other genres, I don't think we could, that idea of the protagonist or a character always being consumed by the idea of their own death. I don't think that anyone could say that Johnny Rocco in Key Largo thinks he's going to die. If anything, Johnny Rocco thinks that he's going to live forever. He's just a little bit upset that he's not quite as powerful as he used to be. But again, that's a direct development of something that had happened in reality in terms of gangsters, which is that Lucky Luciano had been in prison since 1936 is when he went to prison, just to correct something I said earlier. And then during the war had agreed to work with the US Navy to provide intelligence to them as part of the fact that the mafia controlled the docks in New York, for example. So there's an idea of monitoring for spies and providing intelligence and all that kind of stuff. He's released in 1946 because that was what was agreed when he agreed to take part in what was called Operation Underworld. But then as soon as he was released, they deported him to Italy. He then made his way to Cuba. He managed to stay in Cuba till 1947 when pressure from the US government led to him being deported again. And then you've got this story about a gangster who has been deported, who has come back to the Florida Keys and is hiding out in this hotel on the coast. I don't know, I just don't see anything particularly noirish about Key Largo. It just seems like a development of the gangster movie in terms of moving with, again, ripping stories from the headlines, playing on the kind of fortunes of real world gangsters. The character of Johnny Rocco seems like a continuation of the Joe Crozak character from The Last Gangster. If Joe Crozak is mean, then Johnny Rocco is a lot meaner and delights in just torturing his girlfriend,
Claire Trevor.
His name is Claire Trevor. His name in the film is Gay Dawn. Just torturing her throughout the movie, trying to deprive her of alcohol. She's clearly an alcoholic. Trying to deprive her of drink in order to torture her. There's not a single redeeming feature about Johnny Rocco. For anybody who hasn't seen Key Largo, Johnny Rocco is a gangster who's holed up in a hotel in the Florida Keys, which we discover, about 20 minutes? 20 minutes after Humphrey Bogart arrives there to go and visit the father and the widow of a guy that he served with in World War II. And they end up trapped together in the hotel during a hurricane, and things just get worse and worse and worse. But I see that as a continuation of the gangster movie, very clearly, and as a film noir movie second. And I always think it's strange, borderline bizarre, when people describe it as a film noir first and foremost, rather than thinking about it as a continuation of the gangster movie as it had been developing into the 1940s.
But this is because you're focusing on the wrong character, surely. It's perfect noir if you look at it from the point of view of the Humphrey Bogart character, who is absolutely that kind of disillusioned post-war figure who, again, has a kind of morbid sense of nothing matters anymore, the world's coming to an end, there is no
I don't think that was the movie. I genuinely don't think that that's what the film's about, though. I think that what the movie is about is a world in which gangsters are no longer welcome. And the Humphrey Bogart character, and also the other soldier who has died off screen long before the film begins, to me are representations of what America should be, or what the kind of nation should be looking to celebrate post-war, which is that idea of having sacrificed oneself for one's country, building a new society. There is a line, the Lionel Barrymore character says, "We rid ourselves of your kind," to Johnny Rocco. We're not going to go back to an era when essentially gangsters had the kind of power that you used to have. And so much of the film is more about Rocco than it is about the Bogart character, McLeod. It's about Rocco coming to realise that the world has moved on without him, that there isn't a place for him in a modern America, which is sort of represented by him having been deported, even if that was kind of ripped from the headlines with Lucky Luciano and so on and so forth. To me, the film is so much more about Rocco than it is about McLeod. And McLeod is more a vehicle through which to show the sacrifices that American men have made to keep a free America Because there's a couple of weird speeches in Key Largo where the threat of gangsters is actually weirdly conflated with presumably the threat of fascism, or whatever they felt might overtake America had World War II been lost. There's a weird conflation of those two issues, but I think so much of it is about the idea that a world has been built in which gangsters do not belong, and it's about Rocco coming to realise that the world has moved on without him and he's not as powerful as he used to be, and that the character that was once kind of Little Caesar has become this pathetic little man in a smoking jacket in a hotel on the Florida Keys.
So you don't think it's about Humphrey Bogart finding a reason to live, finding a strong woman who is going to help him through these difficult times and build again and move forward from this dark, depressing place because it's all so noirish?
No. But then that's because I'm so much more interested in the history of the gangster movie. And so for me, I read it as a continuation of, and it's much more interesting to me as a late example of the classic gangster movie, as we're getting towards the kind of the end of the classical Hollywood era as we move into the 50s and up to 1960. It's kind of significant to me in that regard, as the way that the gangster film is mutating in the same way that White Heat is. So much of film noir is associated with that post-war context and the idea of the kind of psychology of post-war America. The fact that you end up with psychopathic gangsters in films like Key Largo, White Heat, Kiss Tomorrow, Goodbye is to do with that post-war context, but it's not necessarily to do with a kind of pervasive, pessimistic psychology, as it is to do with the idea that America has just, well, according to a lot of Americans, America has just single-handedly won a war.
Yes, that's right, all on their own, yeah.
And the reasons for why that war was fought and wanting to have won it and wanting to maintain a certain kind of society after that war has been won. Do you know what I mean? And gangsters don't belong in that society, and that's one of the reasons why they've turned into, from these kind of sympathetic gangsters in the 30s to these psychopathic megalomaniacs in the 1940s and into the 1950s, is to do with the idealism of a post-war American society that should not have a place for racketeers and gangsters.
No, and that leads us very nicely to Black Tuesday, which was released New Year's Eve 1954 and is a remarkably stark gangster film with Edward G. Robinson almost in his last gangster role. His last gangster role is technically, I think, Hell on Frisco Bay, May the following year. But Black Tuesday is far superior film to that. I think it's a brilliant film, but it does show, I think, that development that you're talking about kind of more or less reaches a certain kind of apex, because you get James Cagney in Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye, roughly around 1950. We get Robinson in Black Tuesday, and then the following year we will get Bogart in Desperate Hours. And in a way, it's almost like the original trinity of those actors from the Warners in the 1930s who have now reached this era where they're playing the neurotic, psychopathic versions of those characters who, as you say, had been so sympathetic in their own way because they were so charismatic and shown as people who grew from an underbelly where they had no opportunities and were able to make something of themselves, something audiences could really connect to. But now we're in the Eisenhower era, and it's all supposed to be fabulous, and everybody's supposed to have a much better shot at having an equal part of the pie, as it were. And they're just getting angrier and angrier and angrier in terms of these characters. And then that's sort of the end. That's partly because, of course, Bogart dies in 1956, and Robinson, who was of all of them much the oldest actor in terms of when he was born in 1893, he moves on to different kinds of roles ultimately. But it's a brilliant send-off, I think. I mean, what do you think about the film?
It's by far one of my favourite films he ever made. I'm going to have to think about how to describe how much I love this movie. But I absolutely adore Black Tuesday. And I think it is, on one hand, the eventual apex of that kind of transition to psychopathic gangsters, although I would actually argue that Vincent Kennelly in Black Tuesday is a little bit more sympathetic than Johnny Rocco, because at least he very much loves Hattie, his partner,
yes.
who is so for anybody, I assume you've actually got a podcast on Black Tuesday which will be out before this one will, right?
Yes, so you and I will be discussing Black Tuesday ahead of this very shortly. Apologies to listeners who are confused.
Just for anybody who happens to be listening to this episode who hasn't listened to any of the previous content on Black Tuesday, essentially Vincent Kennelly is a racketeer who's doing time on death row, who breaks out of prison on the night of his execution, in fact, literally seconds or minutes before he's due to be executed, and takes several hostages and another death row inmate with him, Peter Manning, who's played by Peter Graves, with the hope that he will be able to find some money that Manning hid away before he went to prison and use that to kind of start a new life. He's not really interested in Manning for anything other than that money that's been hidden somewhere. And it's very much a continuation of the kind of Joe Crozak, Johnny Rocco characters that Robinson had played in the past. But I do think he's a little bit more sympathetic than he is in either of those previous two movies. Partially because he has a partner in Hattie, who's played by Gene Parker, who he genuinely does care for and love. And it's very, very clear that although he does not give the tiniest bit of a shit about anybody else in the movie, he really does love her. And secondly, because he's driven entirely by a will to survive. And in terms of the kind of noirish elements, this very much is a movie about a guy who is completely obsessed with his own death and wanting to survive and wanting to circumvent his own death, in a very real sense, because he's about to be strapped into the electric chair. So the film is very much about survival. And I do think that the film has a very kind of anti-death penalty stance. I think it's very anti-gangster, but also very anti-death penalty, in that Kennelly is depicted as essentially a monster. Outside of any scene where he's not with Hattie, he's depicted as a monster. All of the film's events are brought about by the fact that none of the people who are on death row, and Kennelly in particular, just don't want to die. They want to survive and keep breathing and carry on with their lives. He is certainly depicted as a more intelligent, manipulating and conniving man than Johnny Rocco or Joe Crozak are, who are guys a little bit more driven by their emotions than by thinking about things clearly.
It's a great way to finish our little celebration of Edward G. Robinson, because this is 25 years of his work that we've sort of tried to compress into an hour. But that's a perfect place to stop, in the sense that I think Black Tuesday feels like it's sort of summing up a certain trajectory, but also a certain type of character. He would never really play that role again and wouldn't want to. By this point, he was in his early 60s. And he's just doing other kinds of roles. But he's absolutely fabulous in it. He's just absolutely magnetic.
It's the perfect combination of the more sympathetic characters that he played in the early part of his career and the unbridled psychopathic megalomaniacs he came to play later on. Joe Crozak is the start of that, and then Johnny Rocco, I think, is the pinnacle of that, of him just being an absolute bastard, essentially. And I think Black Tuesday is where he gets to bring those two things together into one character, where you can joy and attraction in watching bad characters do bad things, as you know, which is why he's so watchable in The Last Gangster, or particularly in Key Largo, which I think is one of the best films he ever made. But there is also that spark of sympathy for him that comes about through that kind of clear intelligence that's being communicated in the performance, but also just through the film's thematic concern with survival and wanting to keep breathing, and that very, very human desire to just get to tomorrow and just keep moving. It's very important that he has that motivation that all of us can identify with, no matter what he's done in the past and no matter what evil things he has done. He just wants to keep living and survive. And so you have that nice combination of those kind of psychopathic elements and those sympathetic elements.
I love the way that just the title seems to sum up what we're discussing here today about Edward G. Robinson, in the sense that Black Tuesday is a phrase that's usually associated with the Wall Street crash. And that's 1929. And here we are 25 years later. And here they explain that Black Tuesday is so called because it's the day in which they execute their prisoners, which was standard practice in a lot of prisons at the time, where they would execute people on a designated day of the week. And this is the one that's used by this fictional prison. And there's something just utterly brilliant about that. I think it sort of encapsulates that whole era and brings it to a kind of peak. A great film for us to finish on. So thanks so much for joining me on this, Craig. It's been a brilliant journey. They're all terrific films. And those who are listening to this now will hopefully have listened to the podcast in which we talked about Black Tuesday and we talked about the Blu-ray release that you're involved with. But let's just remind everyone in the UK that Eureka, through their Masters of Cinema series, have released this terrific Blu-ray of Black Tuesday, which looks incredible, based on a brand new restoration.
I should also say that it's number 300 in the Masters of Cinema series, which I'm very happy about, really, because I think it's what might once have been considered a kind of B movie, and I think it's important for us to celebrate those kind of films.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
As well as the films that might immediately spring to mind as ultimate classics. I think it's important to also highlight some very artistically important films that might otherwise have been forgotten.
Yeah, and that's a great example of a film that never released on home video, wasn't broadcast on British TV until 2024 ever. So it finally gets to have this fabulous special edition. I think is really great. So everybody should absolutely go out and buy that one, and not just because we're both involved in some of the extras on it and you did rather more than that, but people can go listen to the podcast dedicated to the film and listen to that conversation. So in the meantime, Craig, thanks so much for being my guest and talking about the great Edward G. Robinson on his 131st birthday.
Thank you very much for having me.
You have been listening to Tipping My Fedora, the show about all things noir. It is produced for Castiglione Publishing by me, Sergio Angelini, and our theme tune is by Petar Milinkovic, whose work is available through Tailkeeper Music. All audio clips are the copyright of their respective owners, and used under fair dealing and fair use exceptions solely for the purposes of criticism and review. Please subscribe to Tipping My Fedora wherever you get your podcast fix, and it would be great if you could leave ratings and reviews about the show at Apple Podcasts. Be seeing you.